Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of videos to help you improve your chess game. One of the series that have come out that's a good instructive anthology, and it's part instructive anthology and part not, is the Move by Move series by Everyman. And some of them are on openings and others are on a lot of the most famous grandmasters of all time. I thought I'd review one of the books today. The book is Caruana Move by Cyrus Lakdawala. And in this book, obviously, they look at Caruana through the ages. He breaks it down into 6 chapters. The chapters are Caruana on the attack, Caruana on defense and counterattack, Caruana on a dynamic element, Caruana on exploiting imbalances, Caruana on accumulating advantages, and Caruana in the endgame. So I picked out a game kind of at random, and it turned out it's from the chapter Caruana on defense and counterattack. And it turned out to be a game against Carlsen, and it turned out to be a fairly long game. So let me read you what author Lakdawala says about Caruana at the start of the chapter. He says, "Being in trouble is not the same as being in a crisis of faith. And I'm pretty sure that some poet somewhere wrote that each passing day is a new beginning, no matter how bad your day was yesterday." In this chapter, we examine Caruana's skill in positions where life has gone wrong and his position is under pressure to one degree or another, or in positions where he must defend and counterattack accurately to consolidate. So let's look at this game, Caruana-Carlsen. As I said, it's a fairly long game. E4, E6. I don't think Carlsen plays the French at all today, but this game was played in 2012. D4, D5, Knight C3, Bishop B4. That's the winner variation. I used to play this a little myself when I was younger. E5, C5, A3, Bishop takes C3, check, B takes C3, Knight E7. That's the main line. So now there's several ideas for white. The old crazy line is Queen G4, and in the book, Lakdawala gives a couple games where Carlsen was black and Caruana was white, not necessarily against each other. He gives the line Queen C7 with the crazy line Queen takes G7. He gives the modern line Castle in the game Caruana-Shanklin, where white played Bishop D3, and white ended up with an interesting position. I think the computer likes castles. So in this game, Caruana plays the positional move Knight F3. Carlsen plays Knight C6, Bishop D3, Bishop D7. It says that's an unusual move. The normal moves are Queen A5 hitting the C3 pawn, or even C4 taking the pressure off the center, but forcing the bishop back to E7. C4 is the kind of move that beginners automatically play. They figure, oh, I'm attacking the bishop with a pawn, that's got to be good. But by taking the pressure off the center, it's kind of a two-edged sword. In this kind of position, because of the doubled C-pawns, it's not so bad. So grandmasters do play moves like C4 here, while there's certainly a lot of other openings, and we've talked about them in other videos, where C4 is a really terrible move, but not here. Okay, so Bishop D7, Castle, Queen C7, Rook E1, and now they're saying the game should continue C4, Bishop F1, Castle Queenside. Instead, Carlsen plays Knight A5, and Caruana correctly plays Knight G5. Now they're suggesting H6, Queen H5, Rook F8, Knight H7 as the continuation. Instead, Carlsen plays Knight G6. Caruana plays Rook E3. The author gives that an exclamation point. C4. And now, to be consistent with his last couple moves, Caruana should play Bishop takes G6. For instance, Bishop takes G6, H takes G6, Queen G4. If Bishop A4 hitting the C2 pawn, Rook F3. And now black has trouble with the F7 pawn. For instance, if he plays Rook F8, then something like knight takes e6, f takes e6, queen takes e6 check. It's going to pick up a whole ton of pawns and a big attack for the knight. So Caruana plays bishop e2, not his best move. Black plays knight c6. White plays bishop h5. Black plays knight c7. White plays queen g4. Notice the bishop on h5 is getting blocked in. You don't want to discoordinate your pieces that way. Now the author suggests black should play knight f5. All the move-by-move authors, of course, have checked their analysis with the computer, as you know, all the modern players do. Okay, bishop to a4. Now white should play rook f3. Instead, he passively guards the pawn with rook a2. Black plays knight f5, and white starts retreating. Rook e1, castle queenside. Knight f3, so you can see white's attack on the king side has disappeared through a couple inaccurate moves. King to b8, h4, rook d to f8. And now black is starting to threaten to move this knight and to trap the bishop. White plays queen h3 to give his bishop a diagonal to go to. Black plays knight ge7. And now white plays queen h2. In the book, author Lakdawala says, Nimzovich would have approved. White's move contains 2 points. One, the queen overprotects e5 in case black gets around to playing f7 to f6. And two, she also makes room for the h5 bishop not only on g4, but if necessary on h3. Carlsen decides instead of playing to the g-pawn now, he's going to move up the h6 pawn and then g5 and try to take advantage of the awkward position of the queen. Bishop g4, g5. And now Caruana has to decide what does he want to do on the king side? Does he want to let black take the pawn? Does he want to try to lock it up? He tries to play h5. The author says this is a concession since now black can later put pressure on the h5 pawn with knight g7, f6, and bishop e8. And he looks at some of the other possibilities. Comes to the conclusion that, h5 isn't necessarily a blunder. So black plays knight g7 to get out of the way of the f pawn and to start attacking the h pawn. Here white should play bishop e3. White plays knight d2. And black plays f5. Now these pawns are going to be very annoying unless white takes en passant. But if he takes en passant, it's going to activate black's army on the king side. But really, white has no choice. He plays e takes f6 check. Black trades queens to get a good endgame. We know Carlsen likes endgames. Rook takes f6. And now perhaps white should play knight f3 again. Caruana plays bishop f3. Black doubles on the semi-open f file. Knight f1. Knight e to f5. Getting out of the way. He's getting ready to play bishop e8. And this pawn's in trouble because if white ever tries to play g4, then the knight has discoveries allowing the attack on the bishop. Okay, white plays bishop g4. Black plays bishop e8, hitting the pawn. White tries to trade off on f5, doesn't help him. Here, black should probably take with the pawn. Black takes with the knight. Now black's advantage isn't quite as easily pushed on to a win as it should be. And Caruana says, all right, I like bishops opposite colors because I'm going to be down a pawn. So I'm threatening to trade knights and go into bishop opposite colors without any other minor pieces. But otherwise, I'm going to play knight g4 and fork the rook on the h-pawn. So Carlsen takes. Bishop takes bishop h5, and black has won a pawn. And now Caruana's on the defensive. King g3 to overprotect the f2 pawn. Bishop g6. Black can create a passed pawn on the h file. White has to be very careful. Therefore, white plays rook b2. And after h5, he plays f3 to try to make it harder for the pawns to create a passed pawn. Here, probably black should play rook to f5 to guard the pawn. Instead, he plays g4. White goes for a blockade with bishop g5. Let's notice if white tries to win the pawn with pawn takes pawn, pawn takes, king takes, then let's see here. Mr. Stockfish, what would you do? Bishop e4, setting up a mating net. Very cute. All right, so back to the game. Turn off the engine here. That's why white plays bishop g5, tries to keep things closed. Rook f5, f4. So now black has that 2-on-1 majority, but the bishop can blockade it, but it does take the bishop out of the game. Black plays rook e8, rook e2. There's a lot of maneuvering in this game. King c7, rook b1, rook f7, rook h1, rook h7. King f2 to get out of the way so the pawn can go up to g3. King b6. So the author says, Carlsen applies the principle, use your king as a fighting piece in the ending rather than hide it away as we would in the middle game. He says the trouble is that his king can't ever chop the a3 pawn because of mating attacks with the two rooks. Okay, so white plays g3, king a5, king e3, getting ready to neutralize the king. Bishop f5, king d2, rook c8, bishop h4. So white's down a pawn, but he's got the extra pawn blockaded. The e pawn is backward, the h pawn is a little backward. Bishop opposite colors. But this is the kind of position, if you're black, even if you don't know how to win and maybe you're not even winning, you should try stuff. And Carlsen's very, very good at that. So even though the game goes for a lot more moves, black's not just going to give up and say, I don't see any way to get through. When you're not sure how to get through, you don't just give people draws. You're up a pawn, give it a try. If you've tried everything and it doesn't work, well, that's a little different. But there's a lot of things to try here. All right, so black plays rook to d7. The author gives these moves without comment because not too much is happening. Rook b6. And now white says, I think I get closer to a bishop opposite color endgame by trading. King takes, rook checks. King c7. Okay, so now black has given up on trying to bring the king up to the a file. And now he's going to try to maybe bring his king over and up on the light squares and try to penetrate on the king side. Okay, so we have rook to king to c1, rook d6, king b2 guarding the a pawn, rook checks, king c1. White says, please, please, please trade off into a bishop opposite color endgame. That'll be an easy draw. Normally when you're winning you want to trade, but this would be an exception. You don't want to trade into a bishop opposite color endgame, only up a pawn unless you see that you're winning, which black's not. So black avoids the trade here. King to b2, bishop to e4, getting out of the way of the king so the king can come up. Also, that keeps the rook out of h1 so that white can't play rook h1 and then move the bishop and attack this pawn. That would force the bishop to have to come back to g6. Okay, so white plays bishop g5. And again, we have a whole bunch of moves given here without comment by the author. As I said, it's a long game with a lot of maneuvering. We can see black now pulling out his plan of bringing the king up to the king side. Black has to push that pawn eventually to get the rook back in the game on to b5. White's waiting to see what black's going to do. Puts his rook on the e file to try to block off the king. Black's just slowly waiting. He's in no hurry. Good endgame players know they don't have to hurry. You don't have to win the game right away. Black slowly improves the position of his pieces. And now he can get his king in. Here it comes. All right, White says, where are you going, Mr. King? I got that pawn guarded there on f3, and you have a pawn on e6, which your rook has to guard. Black says, I'm going to break through with b4. And the author here says, b4. He says, otherwise, black has no plan. So he's going to eventually give up this pawn on e6. White takes, black takes. White starts checking. Black repeats the position, maybe to gain some time on the clock. And then he hides on h2. All right, so black has to decide, do I want to guard this pawn or do I want to give up the e6 pawn? Black says, I'll give up the e6 pawn. And now black plays bishop to e4. Okay, so black's threatening rook to b2, followed by rook takes c2. How should black guard that? White guard that? He should probably play king to c1. But instead, Caruana sees a chance to complicate the game. And it's the kind of position that's going to be difficult to calculate every single possibility. But he sacrifices the exchange with rook takes e4. Rook takes e4 to create two passed pawns that the bishop can support, with the king possibly stopping the black passed pawns. Does it work? Well, let's see what the author says. He says, a good defensive player never agrees to fight fair. Caruana's exchange sacrifice, rook takes e4, is made with the thought, when we wonder about the soundness or unsoundness of attempting sacrifice, there is only one way to find out, play it. Which is interesting. The author is saying something that I tell all my students. If you have a choice between an equal position or an unclear position, almost always choose the unclear position, unless you're in the last round of the World Open and you need to draw for $10,000. You want to choose the unclear positions over the equal positions because that's the way you learn, because what's unclear to you might be clearly good or clearly bad to a stronger player, and you want it to be clearly good or clearly bad to yourself. Maybe it never will be, but you'll learn more when you play the unclear positions. So I think author Lakdawala's comment, when we wonder about the soundness or unsoundness of attempting sacrifice, there's only one way to find out, play it. That's exactly the same thing as my principle, which is if you have a choice between an equal position and an unclear position, play the unclear position. He says, Fabiano succumbs to the temptation to punish Carlsen, since for the normally aggressive Caruana to play passively for so long is the same feeling a chain smoker gets when having to go cold turkey without a cigarette on a 12-hour flight. So he incorrectly decides the time has come to end the subservience. Unfortunately, his sacrifice is unsound and an extravagance. For the exchange, he gets those passed D and F pawns, supported by the bishop and perhaps the king. The trouble is those pawns can be stopped, and with the sacrifice, White has handed Black a passed e-pawn, which is more dangerous than White's two passers combined. The reason I don't give Caruana's sacrifice a double question mark, which objectively it deserves, is that Black's moves now become very difficult to find. So the sack may be unsound, yet we must also factor in the human element, which gives White actual chances to win. White can still hold the draw with the passive yet correct move king to c1. Alright, so clearly Carlsen has to take the rook. Caruana starts pushing the passed pawns, and now Black has to figure out what's the best way to try to both stop the pawns and make progress himself. It turns out, according to the author and the computer's analysis, rook to b1 is winning for Black. And he gives a long line. I'll just give the first few moves. Rook to b1, f6, king to g2 exclamation point, getting ready to help this pawn come in. King e3, rook e1 check, king f4, e3, king e4, rook c1 exclamation point, king takes e3, rook takes c2, hard to find, right? d5, c3, king d3, rook d2 check, king c3, rook takes d5, king c2, rook d7, king c3, king f3, king c4, king e4, king c3. The white king can't get past that force field that the black rook has set up. Rook d3 check, king c2, king d4, pushing the king away, king to b2, rook to c3, he's further away now, king to b1, king to e5, king to b2, excuse me, rook f3, king c2, rook takes f6, and the king is far enough away that the black can win. Let's go back to the game. Okay, well, we don't blame Carlsen for not finding that over the board. He plays the reasonable move king g2, but that throws away the win. White plays king e3, and now black has to play rook to b1. Rook to b1 gets a draw. For instance, rook b1, king takes e4, rook c1, d6, d5, rook takes c2, d6, rook e2 check, king d5, c3, bishop g5, rook f2, and it ends up equal. So in the game, Carlsen plays rook to b2, hitting the pawn. But now he doesn't have time to get to the d file and stop the d pawn. d6, d5, rook takes c2, d6, c3, allowing to guard the rook on d2, d7, rook d2, d8 queen, rook takes d8, bishop takes d8, h4, trying to get another passed pawn. Excuse me. Okay, so this is like a puzzle now. I had if you missed the puzzle in my first video, where you had two ways to take a pawn in the endgame, in the very first video I made for YouTube, I gave an interesting endgame position that was a little bit like this, where you have two ways to take a pawn, and you have to analyze and figure out which way is the right way. You could hand wave and just quickly use general principles to figure out which way you want to take. But hand waving rarely works in these kind of positions. So I would suggest you treat this position like a puzzle. Okay, white to play. You have two ways to capture the pawn, or you could make another move where you don't capture the pawn. For instance, like f6 or king takes e4. So you have to figure out what's white's best move here. So I suggest if you have some time, pause the video, analyze as much as you can. If you want to hand wave, be my guest. But tell me what move you would play here. You don't have to physically tell me, but figure out what move you're going to play. And then start the video again and see. Okay, so the right way to capture, the only way to capture and win the game, is to play g takes h4. If you play bishop takes h4, black will play c2. You're going to have to move your king to d2 to stop it. Then black gets a tempo with e3 check. He can't take the pawn because he gets a queen, so you have to take this pawn. Then he tries to get a queen. You're going to stop him, and then he goes king here, and now he's getting a queen with check, and you're going to lose. So bishop takes h4 loses. Let's see how Caruana won the game. In the game, after g takes h4, Carlsen played g3. White played f6. Carlsen plays c2. White plays king d2. e3 check again. King takes c2, e2. But now the bishop's not on h4. It's free, so it can play bishop h5, a5. And now black has to resign. For instance, black can't play king f1 because white will promote with check. So he has to go to the h file. So he would have to play something like king h2 to get out of the way of the pawn. And then white, now that the king is not guarding the square, he can guard this pawn with the king. And now when black plays g2, he can play bishop g6. And now the bishop can sack for this pawn and the king can take this pawn. And meanwhile, white's going to get a queen. So that would win. So after bishop a5, Carlsen resigned. As I said, king f1 doesn't work. Simply f7. If he plays g2, then f8 queen. Let's just show that. So g2, f8 queen, check. King here. This is rather easy now. White could play almost anything and win. Let's say he plays... let's see. What would be the easiest way to do this? Let's let Stockfish tell us the fastest way to win. Stockfish says king d2. And if black moves out of the way to try to queen the pawn, king h1. Then we pin the pawn. Then he tries to get out of the pin. Then we keep checking him. He has to go back in the pin. We check him. He has to go in front of the pawn. We check him again. He plays king f1 and checkmate. Okay, so Carlsen resigned this position. All right, so again, the name of the book is Caruana Move by Cyrus Lakdawala. I recommend this series by Everyman. As I said, they have a bunch on the top players of all time. You name them, they've got it. Tal, Fischer, Morphy, Lasker, Kasparov, I believe. I think they have a Kasparov book. Let me check. Kasparov, Karpov. Maybe not Kasparov. All right, I take that back on Kasparov. Maybe everybody but Kasparov. Anyway, it's called the Move by Move series by Everyman Chess. And recommend it. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, hit that subscribe. All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.